G'day brewers, Hendo here from the Rockstar Brewer Academy. In this video, I'm going to show you how to transpose a beer recipe from your beer recipe formulation software, I use Beersmith, into Beer30 so you can get brewing with it straight away. Let's take a look. So just to prefix a couple of things, I use Beersmith to do all my recipe formulation and all of my grain and hop calculations and that sort of thing. You might use Brewfather or Beer Alchemy or even ProMash if you're one of the old school people. It doesn't really matter. The purpose of this exercise today is basically to show you how to transpose from your recipe development software into Beer30. The other thing that's really important to note is that Beer30 doesn't do any brewing calculations as such. So you're still going to need some sort of recipe formulation software to work out things like grain load, water additions, and all that sort of thing. For me, it's really simple. Beersmith just does the job for me. I've been using Beersmith even when I was a home brewer and before I became a professional. It just works for me. Your mileage may vary, and that's totally okay. So let's get to it. So what I've got here is I've got a beer recipe for a pale ale, and I have converted everything into imperial units today because my Beer30 instance is set to imperial, but if you are a metric brewer, that is totally okay as well. So as you can see, I've got a beer recipe here. I've got some salts, I've got some enzyme which goes into the mash, I've got some grain, some local domestic pale malt, and some Wyman, Munich, and Carahel. A little bit of Magnum for bittering, some more salts going into the kettle, some Whirlpool hops. I'm going to be using dry yeast today, so I'm going to be using Fermentus US05. I'm going to use 2 bricks of that. And then I've got a little bit of dry hop as well. Okay, so pretty straightforward beer, nothing too over the top. If we have a look at the mash program, the mash is pretty simple. So basically it's a mash in at 131, it gets raised to 152 for 40 minutes, and then it has a mash out of 172 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty easy, pretty straightforward beer. So let's move over into Beer30 and I'll show you the recipe module. So here I am in the Beer30 dashboard, and if I want to go into my recipes, I just go into the recipes module here on the left-hand side. Now, the good thing is with Beer30 is you get unlimited recipes and you can color code recipes and that sort of thing. And you can also archive recipes if you're no longer brewing them or if you just want to save on the clutter. So basically what I'm going to do on this screen is that everything that's written in Beersmith, I'm going to transpose into the beer recipe in Beer30. However, before I start doing that, the one thing that I need to do is to make sure that all of my raw materials are defined in Beer30. So let's just jump over into the inventory module. I'll go to raw materials. And if I go and have a look at my recipe, there was some Barrett Burston Pale, some Wyman Munich 2, and some Carahel. So let's just make sure that we've got those defined. My Barrett Burston malt I need to define, so that's really easy. I'll just go BB Pale, and I'll just click Define Grains. And as you can see, BB Pale now exists in inventory. Now, let's just see if I've got my Wyman malts here. Wyman Carahel, beauty. And I've got Wyman Munich 2, perfect, already defined. Okay, that's great. Let's check the 3 hop varieties. So for this recipe, I need Simcoe, Citra, and Mosaic. So I'll just double check just to make sure that they exist in the system. So no Simcoe. I've got Mosaic and no Citra just yet. So let's define the Simcoe, and I'll also define my Citra, and I'll just hit define hops. And as you can see now, I've got my Citra, my Mosaic all defined, all ready to go. Perfect. Okay. So there are some adjuncts in this beer. So adjuncts are anything basically that are not grain or hops. So in my recipe, I've got some calcium chloride, I've got some calcium sulfate, I've got some bioglucanase, and I just need to make sure that they're all defined. So there's my bioglucanase, there's my calcium chloride, and maybe I've got gypsum. Nope. So the one thing that I don't have defined is my calcium sulfate. So I need to define my calcium sulfate. So I'll go CaSO4, and that is going to be in pounds, and I'll define that adjunct. And as you can see, my calcium chloride and my calcium sulfate are now defined within the system. Don't worry about inventory levels yet. It doesn't matter when you're putting recipes together. Okay, so I've got my grain, my hops, and my adjuncts are almost defined. Now, the thing that I'm missing is my yeast, okay? So yeast, if you're using dry yeast, needs to be defined in two places. So firstly, we need to define it here as an adjunct. And the reason why we define yeast as an adjunct is so that we can keep bricks of yeast in inventory, okay? So I'm just gonna go SAFALE US05, and that's gonna be an each. And I'll click define adjuncts, and that's done. Perfect. And I can see that I've got SAFALE USO5 is defined. Now, the other thing that I need to do is I need to define USO5 as a yeast strain in Beer30. This is used for when you use liquid yeast and you're doing cone-to-cone repitching and that sort of thing. In our particular application, we're just going to use fresh dried yeast every time. So let's define some yeast. So if I go into the yeast module, I'll click define and I'll go SAFALE US05 and I'll go define new yeast. So my USO5 is now defined in Beer30. So now that I've got that, I can actually go and create my recipe. So I'll go back into the recipes module, create recipe, and then I'm going to call this Beer30 Pale Ale. And this is going to be a 10-barrel batch. And I'm just going to call that Beer30 Pale. This is the name that you see when you see the list of tanks on your dashboard. I can give it a color. I'm just going to give it a nice red color. You do have to give it a description, so I'm going to just say demo recipe for now. Now, anywhere you see something in a field that's orange, it means that field is mandatory. Everything else is optional, okay? So I'm not going to worry about BJCP style categories or anything like that. My target ABV for this beer is 5.1%. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to transpose some of the metrics of this beer recipe from Beersmith into Beer30. So if I look at Beersmith, the OG of this beer is 12.4 Platos. It's 45 IBUs, 5.1 SRM color, and 5.1% ABV. So let's punch these into Beer30. So 45 IBUs, 5.1 SRM color. I'm going to call that 2.6 volumes of CO2. And the OG was 12.4 Plato. And the final gravity for this beer should be around 2.2 Plato. Okie dokie. So as I scroll down, there's a whole bunch of things relating to the raw materials, the brew steps, all of the brew metrics and that sort of thing. So let's just go and fill them in. First thing it asks me, which is the yeast strain that you're using? I'm using SAFALE USO5. You can set amounts and that sort of thing, but because we're using dry yeast, I won't worry about that for now. Now our mashing temp, if I look back at our mashing temp, so let's put in 131 Fahrenheit, and I'm going to put 131, the same temperature as our mashing temp. And I'll put in our target mash pH at 5.35. That'll do. Now, looking at Beersmith, this mash is 5 minutes to mash in, but it's going to be a 50-minute mash overall. So the total mash restoration is 50 minutes. My step 1 temp is going to be 131, and then I'm going to go to 152, and then I'm going to go to 172. And that's my mash. So my total mash duration here, 50 minutes. So I'm going to add 349 gallons as our mash water. Our mash out temperature is 172. Okie dokie. Now, pretty standard things in my brewery. So 75-minute lauter duration. First runnings pH should be the same as our mash, which is easy. First runnings gravity, I usually expect to be, that to be about 18 Plato. Now, I'm not going to really worry about sparging and lauter stop and all that sort of thing. What I will do is I'll put in my boil duration. So this is going to be a 60-minute boil. Don't worry about volumes for the moment. Boil pH should be 5.35. And my post-boil gravity should be 12.8 Plato. So with my whirlpool, you've got the whirlpool start and whirlpool stop. So whirlpool start, that whirlpool duration, I usually say that's the time that the pump is running. So let's do, say, 10 minutes of pump duration, and then I'm going to leave it for 15 minutes to rest and to settle before I knock out. So my knockout pH should be 5.35, and my knockout gravity should be what my target is, so that should be 12.4 Plato. Great. So I've set all of the brew metrics. The next thing I need to do is I need to add in all of my ingredients into this particular beer recipe. So the first thing it asks me is all about my mash-in water additives. If I take a look at the recipe, I've got 100 grams of gypsum, 80 grams of calcium chloride, and 30 grams of biogluconate. So they're our mash water additives. So let's go and add them into Beer30. So I've got my gypsum, CaSO4, and that's going to ask for 100 grams. Now, the really good thing about Beer30 is that you add items into the inventory in a certain unit of measure, you can deduct them in any unit of measure you like, and it will keep track of your inventory in that particular unit of measure. Calcium chloride, that's going to have 80 grams of calcium chloride. The next thing I need is my biogluconase, and that needs 30 grams. And that's my water additions done. Now, you can fill in your target water chemistry. Not going to really fill that in today. I'll come back later with brewing water and fill those things in. It's not going to prevent me from brewing. So in my grain bill, if we go back to Beersmith, we've got 551 pounds of Barrett Burston Pale, 110 pounds of Wyman Munich 2, and 35 pounds of Wyman Carahel. Let's add that into Beer30. So I'm going to put in BB Pale, 551 pounds. Then I'm going to add in my Munich, so my Wyman Munich 2, and my Wyman Carahel. And that was 110 and 35 respectively. That's my grain bill done. Now, we can do things like first wort hops, boil hops, whirlpool hops, and adjuncts, all the things that usually go into the kettle. I'm not doing any first wort hops, but I am doing some boil hops. So if I go and take a look at the Beersmith recipe, you'll see that there is 7 ounces of Hallertau Magnum in the boil at 60 minutes. So if I go down to my boil hops, what I want to do is I want to add my Magnum. That is going to be 7 ounces. So I hit my unit of measure for all hops. 7 ounces, 60 minutes. My alpha acid is going to be about 12%, and that's done. Let's do the whirlpool hops. So again, I'm going to use ounces for whirlpool hops. I'm going to add in my Simcoe, my Citra, and my Mosaic. And each of those has about 78 ounces. So 78, that's going to be 20 minutes. Let's call it 190. 78, 20, 190. 78, 20, 190. Oops. Let's fix that one up there. Okay, that's my whirlpool hops, all done. Now, let's look at adjuncts. Okay, so adjuncts are things that may or may not go into the kettle. So we have kettle additions here. So what I'm going to add into the kettle additions is my salt. So I'm going to add my CaSO4 and my CaCl, my calcium chloride. And that's going to get added in at 60 minutes. And again, I'm going to add 150 grams. There's grams. And I'm going to add 100 grams. Just double checking Beersmith here, and I can see that I've got 150 and 100 grams of gypsum and calcium chloride going into this particular recipe. So if I go back into Beer30, I just add them in as kettle additions. Now, yeast. Obviously, you don't put that in at a certain time in the kettle, but we do need to account for the brick of yeast. So I'm going to put in my Safale USO5 And looking at the beer recipe, you can see that I've got 2 packs of Safale USO5. So into beer 30, I will go 2 each, and that's all sorted there. So that's all of my Whirlpool hops, yeast, and salts going into the kettle on brew day. I put in the estimated total number of time for fermentation and cellaring, 21 days. That's pretty standard. You can add in things like error bands, days that your terminal gravity should be within the bands, how long your diacetyl rest runs for, diacetyl rest temperature, all that sort of thing. Now, let's talk about dry hopping, okay? So, with dry hopping in Beer 30 recipes, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can do active fermentation hops, which basically means adding hops at a certain gravity, or dry hops is adding certain hops on a certain day, okay? It's entirely up to you. Or you can do both. For this particular recipe, I'm going to add my dry hops on day 4. So I've got my Simcoe, my Citra, and my Mosaic. And looking at the recipe in Beer 30, it's going to be 77 ounces of each on day 3. So let's let's set our dry hops to ounces. 77, day 3, 77, day 3. Awesome. That's our dry hops done. If we want to add any more adjuncts in, we can certainly add in fruit or anything like that into there, but that doesn't apply with this particular recipe. We can do things like defining actions, okay? Falls a little bit outside of the scope of this video, but if you happen to have actions based on gravity, that's entirely up to you to go and put in. You can do actions based on the number of days in tank. Now, the good thing is that when you go and add actions here on certain days, they'll actually go and appear in the brew schedule, the brew planner, automatically. Any bright beer tank additions, there's none in this particular case. And now that's all done. I hit save recipe and job done. There's my recipe into Beer 30. If I go into the brew module, what I can do is I'll start a new mash in. So I'll just go down here to start. This is how we start a new batch. And I'm going to start a batch of Beer 30 Pale Ale 220830. And I'm going to select an empty tank. And I'm going to go start brew. And as you can see, we've got a number of different brews running here in this brewery at the same time. So I'm just going to select my Beer 30 Pale Ale. So as you can see, it's brought up for me all of the information I need to know about this particular brew. It's brought up all of my water additives I need to add in, my malt, and I can hit start mash and away I go. So as you can see, adding recipes in Beer 30 and transposing them from your beer recipe formulation software is super simple. Just to reinforce, Beer 30 is not meant to do brewing calculations like working out your starting gravity based on the amount of grain that you use and that sort of thing. You're still going to need a beer recipe formulation software, but transposing it into Beer 30 is pretty much a cinch. For me and how I work in my brewery is I prefer to keep my recipes separate to the actual execution in Beer 30 and inventory depletions. It just works really well. If you want to know more about how easy it is to add your recipes into Beer 30, leave a comment below and one of the awesome Beer 30 crew will reach out to you and arrange a demo. Thanks heaps for watching this Tech Tip Tuesday. I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.